This airline tried to halt a fallen soldier's escort. The internet can't stop talking about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation. A fallen soldier is on this flight, and his escort needs to be with him. But the airline is saying no. You heard that right. They're refusing to let this man sit with the body of the hero he's sworn to protect. The tension in the airplane cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers sat in stunned silence as the soldier's escort, a tall black man in full uniform, stood his ground at the check-in counter. He had just requested permission to accompany the casket of his fallen comrade, a young African-American soldier who had paid the ultimate price, serving a country that had not always served him in return. The airline representative, a middle-aged white man in a crisp uniform, barely glanced at the escort before shaking his head. "That's not our policy," he said flatly. The words were spoken with the kind of dismissiveness that had echoed through history, a quiet but powerful reminder of how some rules were never meant to be bent for certain people. The soldier's escort wasn't asking for much, just to be allowed to sit near the cargo hold, where his friend's casket was being placed, as was standard military procedure. It was a sacred duty, one that had been honored time and time again. But somehow on this day, with the soldier, things were different. The gate agent refused. The airline staff looked away. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. But the escort, his face calm but his fists clenched at his sides, was not about to back down. When passengers started to catch on to what was happening, whispers began spreading through the plane like wildfire. A few pulled out their phones, recording the standoff, their faces a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "Why won't they let him stay with his brother?" someone muttered. "This doesn't feel right." And it didn't, because beneath the surface, beyond the thinly veiled excuses and corporate policies, there was something deeper at play. Something ugly. Something familiar. The escort tried again. "Sir, this is a military protocol. I need to be with him." His voice was steady, respectful, but respect was not being returned. The gate agent's response was a clipped, "We've made our decision." No further explanation. No justification. Just a quiet refusal wrapped in the armor of authority. A white couple seated near the front seemed puzzled. "But I thought airlines always made exceptions for military personnel," the husband whispered to his wife. She nodded, frowning. "They do. Unless," she hesitated, glancing at the soldier's dark skin. Her husband looked away, suddenly uncomfortable, because they both knew what she wasn't saying out loud. Minutes passed. Passengers were now watching, waiting. The plane wasn't moving. The tension was growing. Someone finally spoke up. A white man in business attire, sitting in first class, turned to the airline staff and demanded an explanation. "What's the problem here? If this man is supposed to escort his fallen comrade, let him do his job." The staff member hesitated, suddenly aware that people were paying attention, that this wasn't going to be ignored. But still he stood firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a matter of airline policy." That word again. Policy. A word that had been used for centuries to deny, to exclude, to oppress. A word that had been weaponized against people who dared to ask for simple dignity. And now, in this moment, it was being used to deny a black soldier the right to honor his fallen brother. The first-class passenger wasn't buying it. "Then change the policy," he shot back. "Because this isn't about rules. It's about respect." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. A young woman with braids, sitting near the middle, pulled out her phone and started recording. "This is disgusting," she said to no one in particular. "They're really trying to stop a black man from honoring a hero." In 2024, a flight attendant, a white woman with a name tag that read Susan, finally stepped in. She looked between the gate agent and the soldier, her expression uneasy. "Maybe we should make an exception," she started, but the agent cut her off. "We're following procedure." And there it was, the silent nod of complicity, the passive acceptance of injustice, the willingness to look the other way when the target of discrimination didn't look like you. The escort let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. He had seen this before. He had grown up seeing it, hearing about it from his grandfather, a Vietnam vet who had returned home to be treated like a second-class citizen despite risking his life for the country that barely acknowledged his sacrifice. And now, here he was, fighting the same battle, decades later, in an airport of all places. But this time, people were watching. This time, there were cameras. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were speaking up. "This is wrong," a woman called out. "Let him sit with his brother," another man demanded. A few even started to chant. The noise grew louder, the pressure mounting. The airline staff exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't going away quietly. Then, the unexpected happened. A white veteran, his beard streaked with gray, stood up from his seat and walked straight to the front. He looked the airline staff dead in the eye and said, "If he doesn't fly with his brother, I'm not flying either." A moment of silence. Then another voice. "Neither am I." One by one, passengers began standing. A black woman in a Delta Sigma Theta sweatshirt. A young white student in a hoodie. A Latino father holding his toddler. A Muslim woman adjusting her hijab. Different races, different backgrounds, but one united stand. The airline staff panicked. The gate agent's face paled. This was becoming a PR nightmare. He whispered something to his colleague, who hurried away. A few moments later, an announcement crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the misunderstanding. The escort will be allowed to accompany the fallen soldier." A slow clap started. Then cheers. The escort exhaled, nodding once. He didn't need applause. He just needed to do his job. As he took his seat near the cargo hold, his hands resting on his knees, he felt something shift. Today, he hadn't just fought for his fallen brother. He had fought for every black soldier who had ever been told they weren't worthy of the same honor. And this time, the world had listened. As the plane finally prepared for departure, the energy in the cabin remained charged. Conversations continued in hushed yet intense voices, passengers shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just unfolded. Some were still recording, scrolling through social media, already seeing the first waves of outrage building in real time. The video clips of the standoff were being shared rapidly, spreading across platforms like wildfire. The hashtags #HonorOurHeroes and #RacistAirlines were gaining traction. It wasn't just a moment of discrimination anymore. It was a movement, a conversation that was forcing people to take a long, hard look at the reality so many tried to ignore. The escort sat quietly, his gaze fixed forward, his thoughts a storm of emotions. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline lingering in his veins. He had been prepared for resistance. He had lived through enough of it to know better than to expect smooth sailing. But what had shaken him was the blatant, unapologetic way they had tried to deny him a basic courtesy that should never have been in question. He thought about his fallen brother, now resting in a casket just below his feet. A young man full of life, dreams, and ambition, who had once spoken of coming home to his mother with medals pinned to his chest. Instead, he was coming home in a flag-draped coffin, and even in death, the fight for respect had not ended. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane taxied down the runway. The escort barely noticed. His mind was still replaying the faces, the gate agent's cold indifference, the passengers' growing outrage, the first-class businessman's fiery defiance, and the old veteran's unwavering stance. He felt gratitude, yes, but also a familiar exhaustion. It was always a battle. Even now, in the year 2024, even in uniform, even while fulfilling a sacred duty, the struggle had not changed. He glanced out the window, his reflection barely visible against the darkening sky. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "They will always find a way to remind you that your service does not grant you immunity from their prejudices. But you stand tall anyway, because dignity is not theirs to give, it is yours to keep." A flight attendant, the same one who had hesitated before but ultimately tried to intervene, slowly approached his seat. She crouched down slightly, lowering her voice. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. That should have never happened." He turned to her, searching her expression. There was guilt there, genuine and heavy. She had seen it unfold. She had seen the injustice. But she had hesitated, and hesitation had a cost. He didn't blame her, but he also couldn't absolve her. The weight of complicity was something she would have to carry on her own. Instead, he nodded once. "Thank you," he said simply. He wasn't in the mood for a drawn-out conversation. She lingered for a moment before standing back up, smoothing her uniform. "If you need anything, just let me know." And then she was gone. The plane ascended into the night sky, and the cabin slowly settled. Some passengers tried to return to normalcy, pulling out books, plugging in headphones, scrolling through their phones. But the energy of the moment still lingered. It would not be forgotten easily. The escort leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. His duty was not just to his fallen comrade. It was to every soldier who had ever fought for a country that refused to fight for them in return. Hours passed. Somewhere over the vast expanse of clouds, the pilot made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have a fallen soldier aboard this flight. As we begin our descent, we ask that you remain seated while his escort carries out his duty." The escort closed his eyes briefly. It was protocol. It was tradition. It was something that should have never been questioned in the first place. But even now, after everything, it felt hollow. Would this airline have made the announcement if passengers hadn't stood up? Would they have done the right thing if there had been no phones, no social media, no public outrage? As the plane touched down, a solemn hush fell over the cabin. The passengers remained seated, as requested, out of respect. The escort rose, his posture straight, his steps measured. He had one final duty left to perform. The cargo door opened, and the cold night air rushed in. The flag-draped casket was carefully lowered, and he stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart. He had made a promise, and he had kept it. On the tarmac, the soldier's family stood waiting, their faces etched with grief and pride. His mother clutched a folded flag, her shoulders trembling. His father stood stoic, but his eyes gleamed with unshed tears. They had raised their son to believe in this country, to serve with honor, to protect the very freedoms that had so often been denied to their own people. And now, in this painful moment, they saw the price of that service. The escort walked over to them, his chest tightening as he met the mother's gaze. Without a word, she reached out, taking his hands in hers. They were warm, trembling, but strong. She squeezed gently, searching his face for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps understanding. He gave her both. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. He wasn't alone, he said softly. And that was the truth. As the casket was loaded into the waiting hearse, the passengers inside the plane watched through the small oval windows, some wiping tears from their eyes, others recording quietly, knowing that this moment, like the confrontation before it, needed to be seen. The escort took one final look at his fallen brother before stepping back. His duty was done, but the fight was not over. It never was. As he walked away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A friend had sent him a link. The video from the plane had gone viral. News outlets were picking it up. The airline was issuing a statement. Damage control. Empty words. But the world had already seen. And they would not forget. Because this was more than just a flight. This was America. The night air was crisp, carrying the weight of solemnity as the hearse pulled away from the tarmac. The escort stood motionless, watching until the vehicle disappeared into the distance, its taillights dimming against the backdrop of the city. The family had left too, enveloped in their grief, their loss settling into the fabric of reality. The ceremony was over, but the battle was not. He took a deep breath, shoulders squared, his mind replaying everything that had happened in the last few hours. The resistance, the blatant attempt to deny a black soldier the honor he had earned, the casual way the gate agent had tried to dismiss the situation, as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience, the hesitation of the flight crew, the corporate reluctance to acknowledge wrongdoing until they were forced into it by the growing outrage. He pulled out his phone, the screen glowing in the darkness. Social media was on fire. The video had exploded. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. People were furious, demanding justice, calling for boycotts. The airline had issued a weak, carefully worded apology, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But no one was buying it. The truth was raw, undeniable, broadcasted for the world to see. He scrolled through the reactions, a mix of solidarity and the all-too-familiar voices trying to diminish what had happened. This isn't about race. It was just a mistake. Why does everything have to be about racism? Stop playing the victim. He should be grateful he even got to fly first class. Some of us don't get that privilege. If they had followed protocol, this wouldn't have happened. Stop making it bigger than it is. He had seen it all before. The deflection, the gaslighting, the unwillingness to face the ugly truth that no amount of medals or service could erase the bias that ran through the veins of this country. Even in death, his fallen brother had to fight for dignity. Even in service, their worth was questioned. He locked his phone and clenched his jaw. He wasn't in the mood to argue with strangers on the internet. The truth was clear, and the world had witnessed it. But the pain still sat heavy in his chest, the exhaustion creeping in like an old enemy. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You did right, son." He turned to see the older veteran from the plane, standing beside him. The man had his hands in his pockets, his silver hair glinting under the airport lights. His face was lined with experience, eyes sharp with understanding. "I appreciate what you did," the escort said, his voice steady despite the emotions clawing at his throat. The veteran nodded. "Didn't do much. Just called it like I saw it. But you stood your ground." He exhaled heavily, shaking his head. "I've seen this country change, but I've also seen how much stays the same. You learn to recognize the fight when it's happening right in front of you." He paused, studying the younger man. "And you learn to pick your battles. But some you fight no matter what." The escort nodded slowly. He understood exactly what the man meant. "You heading home?" the veteran asked. "Yeah," he said, though the word felt hollow. Home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, a security he had never truly been granted. The veteran reached into his coat and pulled out a card, handing it over. "If you ever need someone to talk to, we gotta stick together. They don't get it, but we do." The escort took the card, reading the name. A veterans advocacy group. He slipped it into his pocket and met the older man's gaze. "I appreciate that." The veteran gave a small nod, then turned and walked away, his steps slow but firm. The escort exhaled and ran a hand over his face. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache. He turned and started toward the exit, his mind already preparing for what would come next. The media requests, the statements, the noise. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight. He had only wanted to do what was right. But now, whether he liked it or not, this moment had become bigger than him. The fight wasn't over. It never was. The next morning, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News outlets had picked up the story. His name was trending. People wanted interviews, statements, more details. He ignored most of the calls, skimming through the messages instead. His inbox was flooded with support from other black service members, veterans, activists, and people who simply understood the injustice of what had happened. But there were also the other messages, the threats, the insults, the ones calling him a race baiter, a disgrace, telling him to stop making everything about color. The ones saying that if he didn't like it, he should just leave the country. He had expected it. He had lived it. But it never stopped stinging. He turned on the news, and there it was, footage from the plane, played over and over, dissected by panels of commentators. Some were outraged. Others tried to rationalize it, twisting the narrative into something smaller, something more palatable. A former airline executive was on one segment, shaking his head. It was a simple miscommunication. The escort overreacted, and the passengers escalated the situation unnecessarily. His hands clenched into fists. Miscommunication. Overreaction. The same words they always used to downplay racism, to erase the truth. He turned off the TV. He couldn't listen to it anymore. His phone buzzed again, another unknown number. He let go to voicemail. Then, a message popped up from an old friend, a fellow soldier. "They want to talk to you. Congress is looking into this. Civil rights groups too. This isn't over." His stomach tightened. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had only been doing his job. But maybe that was exactly why this needed to be fought. He picked up his phone and dialed back. "Yeah," he said when the call connected. "I'll talk." Because if they wanted to silence him, They had picked the wrong man. The hearings came weeks later. The airline executives sat stiffly before Congress, their lawyers whispering into their ears. They repeated the same rehearsed lines about unfortunate circumstances, miscommunication, and policy reviews. But the video didn't lie. The testimony didn't lie. The witnesses didn't lie. The escort sat before the panel, his voice steady as he recounted what had happened, the way he had been ignored, the way they had tried to deny a fallen soldier his honor, the way it was never about policy, it was about race. He looked directly at the airline CEO, his gaze unwavering. If it weren't for the passengers standing up, you wouldn't have done the right thing. And that's the problem. There was silence in the room. The CEO shifted uncomfortably. We are committed to making necessary changes. Change should have already happened, the escort interrupted. But it didn't. And it won't unless we force it. Applause broke out from the back of the room. The families of fallen soldiers, black veterans who had come to support him, people who knew the truth. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about all of them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him. Not just anger, hope, because this time the world was watching, and they would not be silenced. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of media appearances, legal discussions, and public debates. The airline scrambled to control the narrative, releasing polished statements, promising diversity training, pledging to do better. Their social media accounts were flooded with comments, some supporting the company, but most demanding accountability. The outrage didn't die down. If anything, it only grew stronger. Civil rights organizations stepped in, calling for an independent investigation into the airline's policies and past discriminatory practices. It wasn't the first time they had been accused of racial bias, and now, with all eyes on them, the skeletons in their closet began to surface. Stories poured in from black travelers who had experienced mistreatment, denied upgrades, harassed by staff, followed through terminals by security for no reason other than the color of their skin. The escort sat through every interview, every press conference, every panel discussion, answering the same questions over and over. Was it really about race? Did he believe the airline had malicious intent? Had he ever experienced similar discrimination before? He didn't sugarcoat his answers. This is not just about one incident. It's about a pattern, a system that tells us we are less worthy, that even in death, our honor is conditional. He was exhausted. The burden of carrying this fight weighed heavily on him, but he knew stepping away wasn't an option. Too many people had come forward, shared their pain, their stories. This was bigger than him now. The airline's leadership had no choice but to face the backlash head-on. After weeks of silence, the CEO finally agreed to a live televised interview. He sat stiffly across from the journalist, his carefully curated responses betraying his discomfort. We deeply regret what happened. It was never our intention to cause harm, and we are implementing new policies to ensure something like this never happens again. The journalist didn't let him off the hook so easily. But this isn't the first time your company has been accused of discrimination. What do you say to the black travelers who have been mistreated on your flights? The CEO shifted in his seat. We acknowledge that there have been past incidents, and we are taking all necessary steps to address them. We have launched an internal review and are working closely with diversity and inclusion experts. It seems like this only became a priority after public pressure. The journalist interrupted. Would you have done anything at all if this hadn't gone viral? The CEO hesitated, and that moment of silence spoke louder than any prepared statement ever could. Back in his small apartment, the escort watched the interview unfold. He had long since stopped expecting real accountability from corporate America. The airline would make some surface-level changes, maybe issue a few donations to organizations, but nothing fundamental would change unless people kept pushing. His phone buzzed with a message. Turn on the news. Congress is taking action. He flipped to the channel and felt his breath catch. Lawmakers were proposing a bill aimed at protecting the rights of military escorts and ensuring proper treatment of fallen soldiers, especially addressing the racial disparities in how these honors were carried out. It was a small step, but a significant one. He had never considered himself an activist. He was just a man doing his job, a soldier honoring a fallen brother. But somehow, He had found himself at the center of a movement. Weeks turned into months. The firestorm eventually settled, as all stories do. The world moved on to the next controversy, the next headline. The airline rebranded. Their executives shifted around. Their public relations team worked overtime to rebuild their image. Some people forgot. Others didn't. For the Escort, life returned to a strange version of normal. He went back to his duties, continuing to accompany fallen soldiers on their final journeys. But something inside him had changed. Every time he stepped onto a plane, he carried a deeper awareness, a sharper understanding of what was at stake, not just for him, but for every black man and woman who had ever served, who had ever been told their sacrifices mattered less. One evening, as he sat in a quiet airport lounge waiting for his next flight, an older black woman approached him. Her eyes were kind, filled with gratitude. "You don't know me," she said, her voice steady. "But my grandson was in the Army. He passed a few years back. They didn't give him the honors he deserved. We fought, but no one listened. I just want you to know, you did something important. You made them listen." He swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you, ma'am." She patted his arm, a silent acknowledgement of a shared struggle, then walked away. He sat there for a long time, staring out at the runway, watching the planes take off into the night. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But at least now, more people were paying attention. And that, at the very least, was a start. End.